Each and every one here, we're delighted to be outside the house for after about a week. Don't know what I had, but it was very similar to something I'd had before, and wouldn't wish it on my worstest enemy. But headaches, that's about the only thing that really knocks me down, and I had a headache that would not leave for about 4 days. So, and associated things with that, hopefully you didn't get it. I know that there have been some in our midst that had been sick. Don't know exactly. I couldn't believe that nobody else was feeling as bad as I was. I was starting to feel sorry for myself. But anyhow, I picked up something somewhere and did not like it. Glad to be back with you. I hate that I had to miss. And we're going to continue on in our study here, the Apologetics Press material that we're looking in and using as a guide for what we're trying to accomplish. And most of what we're doing, of course, is trying to understand the basic principles and the facts of the Bible and applying those things. We put them together so that we might be more like the people in the Bible who received praise from God and less like the people in the Bible who were condemned by God. That's a pretty common sense way to look at the Bible. And if we see people who exhibited qualities that God holds up as being examples, then we want to be like those people. And we look at all those individuals and we realize very quickly that none of them were perfect. The only perfect person to ever live, of course, was Jesus himself. And so we're going to delve into one principle here that we see throughout the book of Genesis as well as the rest of the Bible. And then we'll go back and connect it to the book of Genesis and where this has such a tremendous application for sure. This is, of course, a psalm attributed to David. This is a New King James Version of this particular passage. So just read it with me, if you will, and then we'll see the significance of this passage as it relates to one of the Bible heroes that we know from the book of Genesis. David says, "Do not deliver me to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and such as breathe out violence." Well, obviously, David's facing enemies. He's facing people who don't want the best for him. They want the worst for him. And then he makes this statement beginning at verse 12. "I would have lost heart unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." Now, what is he saying there? He's saying, I would have been completely anxious to the point of giving up if I did not believe that the Lord was going to allow me some respite from this position that I'm in while I'm still alive, you know. So here he's connecting not the ultimate satisfaction of justice being served in eternity, but he's saying, I want a little bit of that here, and I think I'll have a whole lot of that here. Just be with me in that. And then he says in verse 13, which is really the verse we want to delve into more extensively, "Wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord." So what is the prevailing principle that we see in this particular verse of Scripture? You see 2 times in verse number 13 where he uses the word wait. What does that mean? Be patient. In the long run, ultimately. And notice, that's something that we take great comfort in ourselves today. When we see injustices seem like that's the only kind of justice that exists in our world is injustice. The only type of fairness that exists in our world is unfairness, it seems like. And we always say, well, ultimately, all sentences will be settled, all justice will be provided. But here David says, I want that a little bit here too. And we should desire this well, as much as within our ability to accomplish that, then that's what we want to do. But his concept of waiting on the Lord here is a word, and of course I know you can read Hebrew. There is a word that's translated wait. And as Ricky said, it means to wait for, or to look for, or to hope, or to expect. And, of course, that comes from Brown's, Driver, and Briggs' Hebrew lexicon. Why is that important, do you think? Why is waiting on the Lord, hope, and desire, why is that so important? Of course, we've touched on it a little bit already, because it's not to be found here, is it? You know, even if we see momentary situations in which justice does prevail, then it's not long-lasting. When we see situations in which good is rewarded and evil is punished, that's not the way it is all the time. Many times it seems as though we go months and months before justice actually is served in our society. And so it would cause us to say, what's the use? You know, why should I trouble myself being concerned with doing the right thing? Because sometimes it seems as though I'm the only one that's doing that. And of course, that's sort of the attitude of Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 19, when he was speaking from under the juniper tree, feeling sorry for himself and saying he was the only one left. Of course, he wasn't. There were 7,000 that had not bowed their knee to Baal. And, of course, he'd done been helped by one of them previous in a couple of chapters earlier than that, by Obadiah, who was hiding all of these faithful people and feeding them in caves. But yet that was the attitude that Elijah had. And the reason why Elijah had that attitude is because he was running for his life from Jezebel. So you can understand how that he felt bad about his situation. And, of course, if he even makes a statement, I'm not any better than any of the righteous people that lived before me who ended up dying because of their faithfulness, so go ahead and take me too. Well, if he really wanted to die, all he had to do was go out there and say, Jezebel, here I am. It should have obliged him with it, you know. But he was feeling bad about himself, and rightfully so. And no doubt in this psalm that we have used as an example, David felt that way too. He felt as though that people were boxing him in. He couldn't get out of the situation that he was in. They were wishing evil on him. They were trying to kill him. And, of course, we don't know the specific situation in which he found himself when he was saying this. And it could have referred to many different times in his life. But he held out hope. He held out, wait on the Lord. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Just be patient. And, of course, that's one thing that we probably do not have enough of. And I don't think that anybody's born with patience, do you? I think that's something that has to be developed over time. Of course, I've made the joke before. I used to pray for patience and then had kids and I quit praying. Said, whoa, I didn't mean that, you know. But patience is a very wonderful trait to enjoy. Yes, ma'am. That's exactly right. And that knowing, and of course, as Ricky said, down the line we know ultimately good, righteous, right things are going to prevail. Ultimately. I mean, that's the message of the book of Revelation. The message of the book of Revelation is we win. The faithful win. Doesn't look like it sometimes, but ultimately we win in the long run. And because of that, this is going to apply to one particular individual and his wife here in this study. Patience or faith requires that we wait for the Lord to answer our prayers and keep his promises in his time and not ours. Okay? So the positive view that David had as to his enemies and him being put in a position of peace and happiness and not having to fear for his life from his enemies and all the things that would come his way, not come his way, he had to just bide his time. He wanted relief, and he wanted it right then. No, he said, I got to be patient, and it will ultimately come. And it will ultimately come to us all if we have that same attitude. This fits in line as well in James chapter 5, verse 7. The same principle, therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. And then he uses this example. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and later rain. When somebody goes out and plants their garden, they don't go out the next day and say, what's happened? Why don't I have anything here yet? Well, why don't they? Because they know it takes time. There's got to be some growing that takes place. There's got to be some tending of the weeds that's going to try to choke out whatever you planted. There's going to have to be some things done along the line, and God will do his part. But if you never put anything in the ground, then you're not ever going to get anything to be produced. And so we have to be patient just like that till the end of the harvest. Isn't it amazing how many of the parables that Jesus would use fit into that theme. The farmer knows you don't put a corn seed in the ground one day and then have roasting ears the next. Well, why is he patient? Because ultimately it will produce just exactly what it's supposed to produce. Now, as it comes to the 22nd chapter of the book of Genesis, we know for a fact, of course, that the son of promise has been provided, and the son of promise of Abraham and Sarah, his name is Isaac. It's not Ishmael. It's not Eliezer, you know. Those were two possible substitutions in the finagling of Sarah and the finagling as well in the thinking of Abraham as it related to Eliezer and the servant within his house that he thought might be his descendant. Of course, he may have been a beneficiary of the financial blessings that Abraham had he not had a son, but he did have a son. Not only one son, he had multiple sons later on. But here we're going to be reading about Mount Moriah, and this is a very rough picture, and so that's why I went a little bit more detailed here. And why would Moriah fit into our lesson? What's going to happen there? All right, Isaac's going to be sacrificed. At least that's what is supposed to happen. That's what God has told Abraham to do. Take his son, his only begotten son, and take him into the land of Moriah, and there offer him as a burnt offering. Of course, we know from not only the first lesson in our meeting a few weeks back, but also from our previous study, then God provides a subject for being offered, but it's not Isaac, it's what? It's a ram that's caught in a thicket. One of the things that I meant, if I'd have been here on Wednesday night, would have dealt with how old was Isaac when he was told to offer him. And I'm just going to hit the highlights of this. Has anybody got any idea, speculation as to how old he was? About 17 years old, okay? Yeah, for sure. Even some would go so far as to say he was between 3 and 5, okay? Whoa. Now, what would be something from a common sense standpoint that would sort of annihilate that concept of him being 3 or 4 or 5? He can't carry the wood if he's that. I mean, he may be a strong little old boy, you know, but he's not Samson. He's not be given a tremendous responsibility like that to cause him to carry a large burden. So he's probably 17, 18 years old. He's a young man. He's not a child. And so when you see that, and you see him obediently lay himself down on the altar to be killed, then it carries with it a little bit more respect for his willingness and for what Abraham's fixing to do, doesn't it? He's not a small child, no, but he is a man who has strength associated with him. He's got a mind. And, of course, one of the things that he says is, where's the offering? I mean, we've got all the stuff here necessary for a sacrifice except the subject that's to be sacrificed. And what does Abraham say to that question? God will provide. And he will. There again, there's a principle of faith. There's a principle of being patient, and God's going to do what God wants to do. Now, what did it? There it is. All right, so here we have on this particular, and believe it or not, you probably wouldn't doubt it, but there's been a whole lot of controversy relative to where Mount Moriah is. But what does, just think back to, back in Genesis chapter 9, when the ark came to rest in the mountains of Ararat. Not on Mount Ararat, but the mountains of Ararat. So here's a series of high places that would be mountains in Ararat. Same principle here is true relative to Moriah. Moriah is a general locality, and there are multiple hills on this particular place where it ends up being, of course, the site for what else? The temple. The temple. So some said, well, this is exactly the place where Abraham offered Isaac. This is the place where the temple was built, and that's a possibility, obviously. But we can't say directly that the exact same position is there, and there's a couple other examples here. There's a Mount Moriah is mentioned as, or the mountains of Moriah is listed as a place where Melchizedek offered sacrifices to God. When did that occur? All right. When Abraham was coming back home after he had secured the release of Lot, remember? And there Abraham, of all things, found this fellow in Jerusalem who was referred to as the king of Salem. As of yet, it's not Jerusalem, it's Salem. And he's a priest of the Most High God. Whoa, he's a priest and a king all at the same time. How's that possible? It's possible because we're not talking about the law of Moses. We're talking about that which was previous to the law. That's why Jesus is a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Because he couldn't be a priest under the law of Moses because he was not from the priestly tribe. There again, a principle that we've been studying about the last couple of weeks on Wednesday night relative to silence. And of course, Joel's done a wonderful job of showing that God did not have to say, all right, I don't want no priest coming from the tribe of Naphtali. I don't want no priest coming from the tribe of Ephraim. All he had to do was say, I want my priest to come from the tribe of Levi, the descendants of Levi, and that settles it. He doesn't have to go into great detail saying not, what not. Same way here. Here we are introduced to a fellow by the name of Melchizedek, who is identified as being a man without father or mother. But that's not talking about him being miraculously in the situation or in history. No, it just means as far as who his mom and daddy is, doesn't matter. That didn't have anything to say as to his position as the priest and a king of Salem. And what does Abraham do? He pays tithes to this priest. Now you think about how significant that's going to be later on, is that here's Abraham prior to the law of Moses, and he's paying tithes and offering sacrifice with this priest and this king of Salem when there is no such thing as a Levitical priesthood. And so, in a very real sense, and this of course comes to bear later on, especially in the book of Hebrews, here Abraham, within his loins, the Israelite nation is paying tithes to somebody other than the Levitical priesthood. He's paying tithes to a man who's representative of God and a spokesman for God. And so that's significant there of Melchizedek. And this as well, the place where Abraham offered Isaac, the site of the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. Of course, that figures into, remember when the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant, and they had all terrible physical problems that came their way because of that, and ends up, they find the cart, they find the Ark of the Covenant, and ends up, David buys this place where the threshing floor is in the same locality, and then this is where Solomon built the temple. So this is an important historical place as far as geography is concerned. Now let's look back at what the Hebrew writer says about the events surrounding what happened here in our particular reading. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promise offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. So this explains the thinking that was in Abraham's mind when he was fixing to offer up Isaac as a burnt offering. He had already thought about it in his mind and determined that since Isaac has to be the seed through whom the Messiah is going to ultimately come, if all nations of the earth are going to be blessed through me, and not just me, Abraham, but his offspring Isaac, then obviously if I kill him, God will not allow him to stay dead. What do you call that? We call it faith, but you also call it reasonable. It makes sense. He can't stay dead. Now, how can he draw that conclusion? Because he can't stay dead and me have children through him, where he can have children, where the promised seed might come. So some have looked upon this situation and the instruction of God to send Abraham to kill his son. They said that's the most unreasonable thing in the world. Well, It's not unreasonable. It's what God said to do. Has God ever called upon us to do anything that's unreasonable? Isn't God a logical and a reasonable God? Well, certainly. Do we figure it out all the time in our minds as to how it applies? Not necessarily. Sometimes it's very difficult. But don't say that a command that God gives doesn't make any sense or is unreasonable, and there's no reason behind it. Because everything that God does is reasonable, is logical. It makes sense. Sometimes, as we say, in the final analysis, we say, oh, I see that now. Well, that's the thinking of Abraham. He knew that if he did kill his son, then God would raise him from the dead. And we're thankful for the Hebrew writer of telling us this. Because if he hadn't, then we might make some goofy statement like, that was the most unreasonable thing in the world for God to expect him to do. No, it is reasonable. It is by faith, and it's a reasonable thing. God said it, so it makes sense. If God says to do it, doesn't matter what it is, it makes sense. We may not figure out the whys and the wherefores of it, but it does make sense. Exactly. You know, the attitude that always should be ours is whatever God tells us to do, you do it. You don't say, well, I don't understand how that's got any connection whatsoever. Well, you don't have to. You don't have to. I mean, how straightforward was the restrictions that God placed on Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 2? Of every tree in the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the midst of the garden, don't eat it. The day you do, you die. Why? Who come up with them rules? Well, God did. Well, when Eve was deceived by Satan to look at that fruit and saw how pretty it was, and she had to be thinking anything that's that pretty has to taste good. And since Satan said, if I eat this fruit, then I'm going to be as smart as God, then I've got to do it. I can't help myself. No, you can't help yourself. Because you believe the lie through the lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, and pride of life, and you end up partaking, and you end up suffering eternally, ultimately because of that. So that principle holds true, and Abraham demonstrated it exactly what it is. That's why he's called the father of the faithful. He's not called the father of the perfect because we've already seen many instances in which he failed miserably to have the sufficient faith to simply tell the truth relative to who his wife was. You know. But he was faithful, and that's exactly what we can be as well. And another example here in James chapter 2. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered up his son Isaac upon the altar? Seest thou that how faith wrought with his works, and by works was faith made perfect? And the scripture fulfilled which saith, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. And then, of course, this classic verse, you see then how that by works a man is justified, and not by faith only. The only time in the Bible when you see the words faith only connected together, and it's preceded by, not by. So, when people buy into the concept that's oftentimes promoted that salvation is a by faith only matter, then James clearly contradicts it, and he uses as a test case for that what Abraham did in demonstrating his faith by doing what God said to do. If Abraham said, I believe you, Lord, but I ain't about to do what you tell me to do, then you ain't faithful, Abraham. And nobody else is.
You know, people talk about you can't work your way to heaven, and that's true. That's
Sure.
what it's all about. But Abraham never would have done that work of faith had he not been told to do it.
Exactly.
He wouldn't have ever offered sacrifice of his own self.
Yeah.
Well, he was told to do it, so he was being obedient to what God told him to do. So he did that work which God told him to do.
Exactly. It was a direct result of him actually believing what the Lord said to do. He did it. And sadly, we live in a world in which looks at that concept and says, oh, he thinks he's trying to earn his way. No, he doesn't. No more than when Noah, according to God, did all that God commanded him, so did he. The last verse of Genesis chapter 6. He simply did what God told him to do. That's all he expects out of us. Do what he tells us to do. What do you call that? You call it faith. You call it trust to the extent that you're willing to do what he says to do. And if a person doesn't trust the Lord to do what he says to do, then how could such a person be considered in a right relationship with God? Well, he couldn't be, unless you've got some twisted definitions of what it means to trust and be faithful. Certainly wouldn't apply there for sure. And then, let's go to Genesis chapter 24 real quick, because we're trying to get through 2 lessons in one. And I'm sorry that means we're having to look over a whole bunch of stuff that because I'm going to be gone this next Sunday. I've got to hold a meeting down in Alabama. The congregation down there is desperate, obviously, for a real preacher. And so I'm going to go down there for a few days. So this next week, I won't be here. Not going to make Joel cover the same material that I am, so he'll do what he needs to do in accomplishing that. So let's jump real quick to that, which is the next lesson in that series, and it has to do with another mountain and another decision that has to be made relative to, notice in chapter 24, we're going to be getting a bride for this son of promise, okay? Why do you think that as it relates to matters of faith and acceptable obedience in God's sight, why would we be concerned with, and why would God reveal to us something like this in Genesis chapter 24? Well, let's read the first few verses and we'll see. Abraham was old, well stricken in age. The Lord had blessed him. Abraham said unto his eldest servant that ruled over all he had, Pray I pay thee, put thy hand under my thigh. That's another matter as well. He said, And I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, and thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. What? He's making his servant, who's going to help him to carry out his desires here, he's going to make sure that his son Isaac doesn't do what? Doesn't marry a Canaanite. Doesn't marry one of these people that are neighbors that live in this vicinity of the world. Now, reckon why that is? Because of the character and that which consists in amongst the Canaanites at this period of time. Now, keep in mind that these are the beginning stages of what ends up happening when Joshua goes, as he leads the Israelite army into Canaan many years later, and destroys with the specific responsibility of exterminating the Canaanites in the land, because the iniquity of the Amorites, which is Canaanites, will be full. In other words, there will be no redeeming qualities whatsoever in the inhabitants of Canaan. And these are the beginning stages of that. So the simple principle is this: you've got to be careful who you what? Marry. Marry. Now, that didn't just come along here in the last few years. It's always been that way. You've got to be careful who you marry. And remember, Abraham is held up as an example of one who not only leads his family, but leads his grandchildren after him. So certainly, he's going to be concerned with who he ends up as with a daughter-in-law. Who's she going to be? Is she going to be somebody that's conducive to the spiritual well-being of his son, or somebody that's going to drag him in the opposite direction? Which one will it be? So he's concerned about that to the extent that he wants to get a wife from some of his own family members, extended family members, from whence he came. So here are people who are not as eat up with idolatry and licentiousness and ungodliness and prevailing sexual promiscuity and all that associated with the Canaanites. And they were known for that. But it's someone that's closer to what God would have them to be, and ends up sending Isaac to find him a wife here. Now, what's interesting is when this takes place, Sarah has been dead about 3 years, okay? And it really has been a burden on Isaac to not have that female influence in his life. And he's not a 16-year-old boy. You know, he's an older man. But he needs him a wife, and so this whole situation is dealing with that. Sarah was 127 years old, and so Isaac was 37 years old when his mother died, so that would make him about how much here if it's been 3 years? He's 40 years old. And somebody says, what does Abraham think he's doing, engaging himself in the desires of his son to have a wife? Get your nose out of he's old enough to make decisions for himself. Well, he ultimately is going to be held responsible for the decisions that he makes, but does not Abraham still have a responsibility to guide him in the right direction? Well, sure he does. So how do you look upon arranged marriages? How do you look upon them? It worked in that case, didn't it? Now, when you think about arranged marriages, and we know that it still exists around the world, you marry somebody you've never seen before and all that, and sometimes people rebel against it, but one of the things that oftentimes happens as well is that they end up developing a love for that spouse that they was forced into, which shows that you can learn to love just about anything or anybody. You know? And of course, here's two individuals, if they're focusing on and trying to accomplish the same thing, they're going to become close. You know, I was reading not too long ago where there was a discussion about this whole matter as to arranged marriages and marriages that are not arranged. And the guy was making some pretty good points when he said, just think of what we see happening in our world today when there's no such thing as arranged marriages. How's that working out? Well, would it surprise you that if in those areas where marriages are arranged, there's a whole lot less divorce than there is in the society that allows anybody to marry anybody at any time, just about? So the restrictions that Abraham was placing on his son should not be something that we laugh at and say, isn't that an old-timey way of looking at things? No, it's a pretty smart thing to do, for sure. And if we're honest with ourselves, we would have to admit that that would be a little bit more in liking with what we ought to be doing today, is involving ourselves in the decision-making business of 40-year-old kids? Well, how about 20-year-old kids? How about 18-year-old kids? Well, it's their life. Let them live by their decisions. I don't want to put any input into it. You better put some input into it, because you're going to be responsible for the lack of influence that you have in a matter so fundamental and so basic as this. It does matter who you marry. And if you don't want to have a bunch of heathen grandkids running around, then you're not going to allow your child to marry a descendant of Ahab and Jezebel, which, of course, is exactly what happened to Jehoshaphat when his son married Athaliah, who was as wicked as her mother was. So he wants to go get the right woman, and the right woman ends up being the daughter of a man by the name of Bethuel. And Bethuel had a son who was the brother, of course, Rebekah, and his name was Laban, and so ends up all that happens there. And God specifically tells how this is going to turn about, is that when they get to this locality, then if there's a girl there, and she offers to give you a drink of water and offers to feed you stock, then she's the one. Now, we wish we had such abilities today as to, now here's two things that's going to happen. If she does that, it wasn't a matter of love at first sight, you know. What is it? When my eyes met hers, I knew she was for me. Of course, she was married already and had 3 kids, but our eyes met each other. That didn't happen here. This was an arranged marriage. And the one that was chosen ended up being, of course, one who figures prominently into the genealogy of Jesus as well. And the thing that brought them together was not that they both liked to watch NASCAR, or that they both had black hair and brown eyes. No, none of those things that mattered. They had a like faith. They had the same religion. They believed in the same God. And that overcomes any differences that happen to exist in people. Even to the point of skin color or language or you name it. You name it. The difference, and that's, when I was young, and nobody ever said this, I don't know why, but there were a lot of people back in the 60s and 50s who would look down upon interracial marriage. And you know what they'd use as an example? Something like this right here. They'd say, see, children of Israel were told, don't marry anybody that is not an Israelite. If you do, you're sinning. But was that because of skin color? Absolutely not. I mean, they didn't do with skin color. It had to do with religion. It had to do with who do you believe and what are you going to do in your life religiously and spiritually speaking. That was the distinction. And it's amazing that many times during those years, the papers, even among brethren, were silent in regard to the foolishness associated with trying to speak against and to work against any such thing as two people from different cultures marrying each other. And it wasn't just black and white either. I know of cases right here in the valley in which it was a Caucasian and a Vietnamese. Because if you're going to take the position that it's sinful for a black man to marry or a white man to marry a black woman, or a black woman to marry a white man, or vice versa, then you're going to have to do the same thing as it relates to Asians. And then you're going to have to get real specific on, do they have to live in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere? Or what if they, what are you going to do? Where are you going to draw the line? Well, the line was not drawn by God. It had nothing, absolutely nothing to do with these differences. It had everything to do with their religion. Thus, if you don't want to be contaminated by the ungodly influence of Canaanites, then you don't let your child marry a Canaanite. Simple as that. Now, why would that be looked upon as confusing or bad or something like that in our society? I don't know. I mean, I've heard people make this statement. Well, if they don't marry them, they might not ever get a chance to marry anybody again.
Yeah, the other one is follow your heart.
Yeah, follow your heart. Follow your heart. When Solomon says your heart is deceitful above all things, don't follow your heart. You don't follow your hormones. That's not the biblical principle. It's use your mind. And of course, it's hard to tell 18-year-old kids to use their mind because most of the time they don't have a clue. And we all know that by experience. We knew everything there was to be known was 18 years old. No, we didn't. We didn't know doodly squat. And yet to convince a person of that age that they need to pay a little bit of time and thinking and use of their intellectual abilities to draw conclusions that are ultimately going to be good for everybody involved, then sometimes that's a difficult point to get over, for sure. So there's a significant reason why we'd have a story like this in the book of Genesis, because of the need to have a home as God would have the home be. And certainly it starts off with a husband and a wife. Now, it doesn't mean just because they're united in their desires and in their attitude that everything's going to turn out just exactly the way it should in the family. But certainly it's going to be more difficult if there's not a united front between the husband and the woman, husband and the wife as it relates to their marriage and their hope for heaven. Any other comments on that right there? All right. I've got some questions then. I want to do a little bit of review here so that we can make sure that we know and remember some of the things we've already mentioned. Concerning how old was Abraham when God promised him a son? First time. 75. Now, if you're 75 years old, what if God promised you a son? Oh, no. How old was Abraham when he actually got his son a promise? 99. So here we got nearly 25 years later. What did Sarah do when she heard that she was going to have a baby boy? She laughed. Somebody said, well, it was just on the inside. Well, it's still, she lied. Who was Abraham's first son? Ishmael. And who was his mama? Hagar. And if you haven't ever studied in Galatians chapter 4, the allegory of Hagar and Sarah, then you need to study that for sure. What was the name of the son of promise? Isaac. Now, one of the points that sometimes is made by those who take pot shots at the Bible and say there's contradictions is that the text identifies Isaac as being his only begotten son. Of Isaac being Abraham's only begotten son. Someone said, well, wait a minute. That can't be the case. He's already got another son. So how do you explain that? All right. He was the son of promise. That other child was his child, but he wasn't the son of promise, as was. Now, do you think that the Muslims believe that? Nope. Let's not bring that up for sure. What was Ishmael? Well, we done said that. How old was Ishmael when Isaac was born? 14 years old. So you can imagine there might have been a little bit of friction there as time went on. Of course, the Bible refers that to be the case as well. So how old would that mean that Abraham was when Ishmael was born? 86. And what does Isaac mean? Laughter. Laughter. All right? Now, with today's, actually last week's, where was Abraham when God commanded him to offer Isaac? That's a hard question. Beersheba, okay? But then he was to take Isaac and offer him on Mount Moriah. And how far was that from Beersheba? 3 days' journey. And what was the question that Isaac asked Abraham? We mentioned that earlier. Where's the lamb? Where's the suspect to be offered in his sacrifices? And what kept Abraham from following through and sacrificing his son? All right, God stopped him. He stopped him. And then a ram was offered. What would you say that Abraham revealed in the instruction he received and what he did in behalf of that instruction? What do you call what he did? His faith and obedience, simple as that. He trusted God completely, and then, of course, in addition to what the Hebrew writer says, he had figured out, at least in his mind, a possibility. Now, he's not saying this is the only way it could happen, but it's the only way he can figure it could happen, for sure. And another point that's oftentimes made as well, and this came up a few years ago when people started saying that everything we do in life is worship, okay? That life is a continual situation of worship. And, of course, one of the reasons why that idea was promoted was to try to say we don't really have to have Bible authority for what we do in worship, or we don't have to have Bible authority to do for what we do in life, okay? And so if we throw life itself into the area of everything we do is worship, then God didn't tell us to eat hot dogs last night. Then if we want to eat hot dogs, then that's fine, even though God didn't specify what to eat on Saturday night. Maybe a hamburger or something. The only problem with that is from this example is that when Abraham and Isaac started up into the mountain, they told the young men that were traveling with them, stay here while we go yonder and worship. So you mean you ain't worshiping down here? Well, if all life is worship, then you're just worshiping. When you're just traveling there, you're just worshiping. When you're just playing ping pong, you're just worshiping. When you're just eating stuff, no, that's not the case at all. All life is a life of service, but it's not worship. That's something entirely different, and that's a reason for us to bring it about here. And then we've done mention this, that Isaac was 37 when his mama died, and then 40 when Abraham sends his servant with him, and they go to find a wife, Nahor. And why was that? Because he wanted somebody from his own family to end up marrying Isaac. It wasn't his sister. what did the servant ask? Who did the servant ask for assistance in finding Isaac a wife? He asked God specifically. And where did the servant find him a wife? By the well. And how did he know that she was the one? Because she helped the servant water his camels, and she invited him back to her house as the servant had prayed. Now, another little point here that it's amazing indeed, but people look at this passage right here and they say, look at that crazy thing that simply did not happen. There was no such thing as a domesticated camel at this period of time. It was 1,000 years later before mankind had ever domesticated camels. And so people read that, and some scholarly person with a list of degrees after his name that long says, well, that can't be so. They couldn't have been any camels being domesticated because the book says here that camels were not domesticated until 1,000 years later. Well, let's go a little bit further in our thinking. If the Bible says camels were domesticated then, they were. They were. And when you look at secular history at this period of time, there are actually uncovered Egyptian hieroglyphics, or whatever you call it, in which you've got people pulling camels, hanging on to camels, riding on the back of camels. You got pictures of that happening. When? Prior to the events here described in the book of Genesis chapter 25. So anybody can say that's not so. But can they prove it to be not so? No. They can just object to it. But when the evidence all comes to bear, it proves they didn't know what they was talking about. And when people take so many and make so many attempts at discrediting the Bible, and they keep being shown to be foolish over and over and over and over again, you'd think they would cease and desist making fools of themselves. But they don't. They just keep on doing it. Sadly indeed. And how many years after Isaac's mother had been dead that he ended up getting married? Of course, that figures into what we already said. 3 years later, so at 40 years old. So what would it draw as a conclusion from this? Don't get married until you're 40, obviously. I know it's hard. Some of us feel like when we get to 40, you got 1 foot in the grave, but then, But then when you get to be 69, you realize, no, didn't have 1 foot in the grave then, it's now. You got 1 foot in the grave. So the conclusion we have to draw from this example is not, you can't get married till you're 40, but it is, be careful and make sure the person that you're marrying is a person that will help you to make it to heaven, and you can help them to make it to heaven, and not because of any other type of situation other than that. Anything else? All right. We'll dismiss right here. You got a few extra minutes to do what you need to do, and I appreciate your attention and contribution to our class.